taking on bureaucrats and corporations that would stand in the way of health freedom. Here's Robert.
More revelations coming out versus official stories that are there to protect officials, as my superhero sidekick, Liam Scheff, and he is a superhero in his own right, back with me. And we are bringing back a guest that I had on, I don't know, it's been a number of years. His name, David Steele, attorney in the San Francisco Bay Area. He was actually at the, what was it, in Fort Bragg. There was a big case. We've talked about it the last few days, where HIV was on trial, HIV tests were on trial, or was it a guy who they claimed to have HIV was on trial? We're going to get to the bottom of what happened there because David Steele was there. Liam Scheff, David Steele, welcome back to the Robert Scott Bell Show.
Hey, Robert, thanks for having me. Hello, Liam.
Hey, good to hear from you. I'm desperate to hear about the inside of the courtroom down there in Fort Bragg. You were there, sitting in the bleachers. Did you have a good seat?
I had a front row seat, and it was a court martial at a big, tall, fancy courthouse on Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the home of Delta Force and the 82nd Airborne. And there was a lot of young, rugged men and women in green Army fatigues, armed with weapons throughout. So it was a pretty civil and polite process, I got to say.
Yeah, people respected each other's boundaries.
I think so.
You don't really mouth off in an environment like that, let me tell you.
No napping.
No, an armed populace there is a polite populace. Now, is this kind of like a John Grisham novel? People are always asking when you go in and witness a trial like this, because literally the stakes are huge. If I'm not mistaken, and Liam and I covered this last week as well, as this was breaking from Clark Baker in the OMSJ, that they were trying to basically give this guy a life sentence because he supposedly was spreading HIV, not telling partners that he was supposedly infected based on test results that were given. So a lot hung in the balance for this guy's future. We don't know whether he's a good guy or a bad guy, but the issue was very different than many, let's say, trials in this realm.
Yeah, he was a good guy. And he made some mistakes, but he was a good guy. And you're right. I mean, he was facing 37 years of prison, and his crime was having consensual sex with some women. They used a condom the whole time, but he did not disclose that he was told by the Army that he was HIV positive. So it was almost like assault with a deadly weapon, no knife, no gun, but HIV supposedly was a deadly weapon. But there wasn't any evidence in the courtroom that the women had contracted HIV, so it wasn't, another person being harmed, allegedly. It was just the misconduct of this sergeant, who I'll call PD, his initials, just to give him a little bit of privacy.
So you're sitting there, they're prosecuting him because he tested HIV positive. No, he hasn't, and he walked away with nothing. I mean, he sat in the brig for a number of months, right?
He did. He was, I believe it was 8 months before the trial. Yeah, he walked away a free man.
Walked away a free man, except he's got to live with this HIV stigma. But we'll talk about HIV testing later. But in court, apparently he was somehow not accused anymore of having spread HIV. So how does that work? How do you go from being accused of spreading HIV? What did they pay off the judge? Did you have an in?
You do not pay off a military judge like this. Trust me. It was a fair trial, and it was they had a confession from TD, or a written statement from the military investigators, admitting that he had sex with these women and did not disclose the HIV status. So the prosecution thought it was a slam dunk. I mean, you got a confession, you got the women, two of the women that he had sexual relations with came and testified. I mean, it seemed slam dunk from their perspective, but when you probe a little bit and you say, okay, wait a minute, how reliable and valid are these underlying HIV antibody tests? And the answer came out in trial scientifically, not very. There was an expert, Dr. Rodney Richards, who has a PhD in chemistry, who worked for Amgen for many years and studied these tests and dissected them, and he was very effective in saying, look, these tests don't detect HIV, and the antibody is not a good surrogate marker for HIV because it lights up with 60 or 70 other different conditions. So the bottom line was, the argument was, this man is not infected with HIV, or I guess more precisely, there is reasonable doubt whether he's infected with HIV. And obviously, if there's reasonable doubt on the medical diagnosis, then there's reasonable doubt on the crime. And that's why I believe he was found not guilty for those allegations.
Well, didn't the prosecution bring in some so-called medical expert witnesses to testify how definitely infected this guy was?
Well, they did. They had a very intelligent, articulate commander who was from the Navy, and he was an MD, and he worked with AIDS patients, and he gave a standard narrative on what HIV is, what it does, what the treatments do, et cetera, et cetera. But he was not very, in my opinion, solid on the tests. It was more an assumption. It was more a narrative. And when you get down to look at these tests, particularly if you look at the package inserts on the test. For example, this AIDS expert hadn't read the package insert on the test until the Saturday before trial. I mean, man's been practicing for 15 years and really isn't looking at what the manufacturers of the tests are saying about their own tests. And when you dig deep like that, which is what Dr. Rodney Richards did, the tests make all these qualifications and equivocations. They say it's a presumption of this, it's a presumption of that. We're not sure what it means if the patient has no symptoms. And this defendant was totally healthy. He was asymptomatic. So what does it mean if your test lights up and you're asymptomatic? And Richards, I thought Dr. Richards did a very good job of kind of puncturing so many holes in this test and this theory that the prosecution AIDS expert, really had no foundation to stand on.
David, you said that, did he admit under oath that he had never read the insert until the weekend before he was set to testify?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, if someone can correct me if I got that wrong, but that was my record. That was what I heard.
Wow, that is stunning. I mean, we're not really surprised about that, but to get it on the stand, on the record, and this is reflective of so many in the medical realm that, basically employ these tests, rely upon these tests, and you think that they, of all people, would be the first to say, well, I better learn everything I can about this test because I'm about to condemn a person perhaps to death or at least to a fearful life.
Yeah, there's something really, scientifically rotten about these tests. And there's some good papers in the literature. I mean, that's another important point. I mean, people think of criminal defense attorneys as guys who just have, the accused is obviously guilty, and it's just a game to figure out some loophole to get him off. And so maybe these were just clever attorneys, saying anything to get reasonable doubt. It's not true with these tests, though. I mean, there's some papers in the literature. There was at least one excellent paper published in 1993 in a very prestigious scientific journal, Biotechnology. It's a sister journal of Nature, which is at the top of the hierarchy, and it's published, I think the authors are Eliopoulos, Papadopoulos, and Turner et al., and it asks the question, is a Western blot result proof of HIV infection? And it does a really good job of showing that it's not. Antibodies are the, I'm not a doctor or scientist, so, I could be wrong on this, but this is what I gathered from the trial.
David, neither are most of them. They just memorized a lot of stuff and paid a lot of money for them. But go ahead.
Okay. The human body produces antibodies in response to some external insult to your body. If you're infected with a bacteria or virus or fungus or anything, maybe a chemical. So your body produces antibodies. Okay. Well, that's the normal process. But for some reason, these HIV tests became entrenched and with this belief that antibodies, presence thereof, is synonymous with current infection, specific infection with HIV. But the problem is there's so many, quote, false positives, unquote, that are documented in the literature. For example, there's cases in the literature of people with tuberculosis lighting up an HIV antibody test, and the flu, and hepatitis, and vaccinations. So, part of the testimony was, the AIDS expert doctor kind of mocking that. Well, this guy doesn't have hepatitis. He doesn't have tuberculosis. That's not the point. The point isn't whether it was a false positive. The point is there's so many false positives that it undermines the reliability of this test. What good is a test for HIV that lights up for HIV plus 70 other conditions?
Or
it's an invalid test.
Maybe 120 if you read Liam's chapter on HIV in his new book, Official Stories. So it really rounds it out. And not to confuse the issue, but to add something you said, David, and Liam, you could chime in on this, that suddenly, and never before in whatever immunology it is, whether it's considered junk immunology or primary immunology, the fact of the matter is it used to be that the idea of having an antibody was a very positive response, positive body response. And for the first time with this so-called AIDS scenario where they linked the HIV and said it was the cause, the identification of an antibody for the first time meant you were going to die rather than you were going to live. And I interviewed Professor Duesberg over the years on this, and it just made no sense from the beginning. But here's another aspect where in a court of law, not in a place where the so-called pseudoscientists that have all their money invested in this reality or artificial reality, you now have the ability to call into question these so-called experts. And Rodney Richards, if I'm not mistaken, Liam, he was a guy that helped to develop the Western blot. Is that right?
He co-founded Amgen, and they worked on the first antibody test. Would have been the ELISA test. But you know what? To say ELISA and Western blot, this is wonky. You know, they're all a bunch of, you know, I'll just say it. They're a bunch of crap proteins. Robert Gallo was mixing together cancer cells. He was such a genius that he and a couple other guys, David Baltimore and Fauci, these morons, decided, that's what I said, come and find me. That's what they are. They decided that they could find an enzyme process, which you find, it's pretty voodoo stuff, by the way, to say you found an enzyme, because you can't hold it in your hand. And they said this enzyme can now stand in for finding a virus. They call it reverse transcriptase. It's a process that occurs in all your cells, and they knew it in 1970-71. Howard Temin and David Baltimore knew it, and yet they all took money when the AIDS bandwagon came into town with the gay guys who'd been annihilating their intestines in these ghettos, and these gay ghettos in Chelsea and the Castro for 5, 8, 10 years. You don't get up from having chronic antibiotic poisoning, from putting benzene into your colon, from stripping your guts. You just don't recover easily. But the public got sold on this thing as a sex virus. Now they have these tests, these malarkey tests. They got proteins out of Robert Gallo's, cancer cells. Those proteins are now synthetically made. They're called recombinant proteins. They're not even from a virus. They're not even from any particular particle. They're made in bacteria according to consensus agreement. So when you're tested for one of these things, I don't even know. Roberto Geraldo did a great study in the late 90s. He worked at a medical lab in New York City. God bless everybody who lives there, because somebody needs to look out for you. That place is a mess. And he said, why are we diluting the blood so much before we run this test? We're diluting the blood 400 times. That means that whatever's in there is so dilute, we're not even going to sense it. Why don't we not dilute the blood and see if you're actually tested for anything? So he got about 100 samples from doctors who worked there who wanted to be tested. He ran it diluted, according to instructions, and undiluted. Guess what happens when you run HIV tests on normal human blood?
When we come back from this break, Liam's going to reveal exactly that.
You turn into a marshmallow. No, that's not the answer.
No, we're going to get the answer momentarily. David Steele is on with us. He's an attorney in San Francisco. He was at the trial in Fort Bragg. We're talking about this remarkable case where a man accused of spreading HIV was completely, let's say, set free from that artificial reality. We're going to talk more about that and, of course, what happens when you test undiluted blood for HIV after this.
The Robert Scott Bell Show. Robert Scott Bell.
Let's take a walk on the wild side.
Alrighty then. You're everywhere, baby. Radio, TV, the papers. Am I right or am I right or am I right?
Robert Scott Bell.
The courtroom drama continues here on the Robert Scott Bell Show. Actually, there's no drama. We already told you the outcome. That's why we had a cliffhanger going out of break there. Liam said he was going to tell us what was going to happen when was testing the blood that was not diluted, the 400 or so times that it was described how to do it in the test. We're also on with David Steele, and we continue on now. Liam, what was it that he found?
He He found the answer to all his dreams. He got a pony. He finally got the pony he wanted. No, it's Roberto Giraldo. You can look it up. HIV tests are not HIV tests, and here's the answer, everybody tests positive on tests for HIV. Well, what?
100%.
That's right. Everybody, 100% of people, you run these things undiluted, you all test reactive because the proteins are non-specific. And in that, what was it, David? It was was it the emergency medicine paper?
The paper I referenced was in Biotechnology, 1993.
Right, the Nature Biotechnology article that we call them the Perth group, did excellent, truly trailblazing research on. They've pointed out that these proteins have similarity in weight, or at least with reactivity with normal human body proteins like actin and myosin. So what are they testing for? Robert Gallo mixed together samples from 10 guys, or his lab lackey did it, Popovich, and Gallo took credit. He mixed together 10 things, mixed it with pre-existing cancer cells, and that's what you're being tested for. So back to the court case, this guy comes up positive on something that comes from pure, and I'm putting down, I mean no disrespect to real voodoo when I say this, but this is voodoo science.
Now, in the trial there, David, I mean, you're revealing some things like Liam, maybe not as graphically detailed, maybe more so about this. I mean, were there gasps in the crowd as they see these so-called experts being questioned and they cannot answer those questions adequately or even at all?
Not really, and I don't mean to put a wet blanket.
No,
the courtroom is very solemn, and it's very structured. You don't have the color and the commentary and the fascinating insights of our friend Liam Scheff. You have kind of dry testimony, but because it's narrow. But it has to be, because the science is so impenetrable for most normal people. I would say it's impenetrable for many doctors and scientists, this retrovirology subject. But also, there's a human component. It's so emotionally toxic to talk about HIV and talk about AIDS, particularly the people who have been told they're HIV positive. You know, I'm very sympathetic to them because they're really saddled with this very harmful, traumatic stigma, and they don't know to ask or inquire about the basis for the diagnosis. They're trying to cope with it. So, you know, it's very important that when you're talking to HIV positive people, that there's a degree of sympathy and warmth and compassion, because, you know, they have been most victimized by this whole AIDS industry. And so in the courtroom, both sides try to stay away from that. They try to stay away from those big macro views and hone in on the evidence. And so, you know, the proper question at trial was, what is the evidence that the accused, TD, is infected with HIV? And even the PCR test got mentioned by the opposing AIDS expert, but even he had to concede that PCR tests are not to be used for diagnostic purposes. So the only real basis, because you know, TD had no symptoms. He was a healthy, young Army sergeant. He had no clinical symptoms. You would never think he was sick. You walk down the street and see him, or walk, you know, into a restaurant. It's all based on this Western blot test, and the Western blot test was undermined greatly as being unreliable. That was the kernel, the nucleus of this criminal prosecution.
So the tests are not reliable, and what Rodney Richards, Dr. Richards, I should say, what is he, chemist? I mean, he helped build these tests.
Yeah, he's a PhD in chemistry, and you know, he knows. He actually worked on, I believe, he had 7 or 8 patents, and some of them were on the viral load PCR test. They were, I think, competing with Merck or Roche or whoever marketed the viral load test. So he knows the tests and the algorithms forward and backwards. He's really an excellent witness. And Dr. Nancy Banks was also an expert witness, and she was excellent. She's an OBGYN from New York City, studied at Harvard, got her MD at Harvard, and so she had to deal with women who were told that they're while pregnant that they're HIV positive, and so she learned about it and studied it, and she made a remarkable piece of testimony by saying that even the mainstream acknowledges that African Americans are 5 to 7 times more likely to test positive than whites. Well, that's crazy. What kind of a test does that? What does it say about a test? Is it a racist test? What it means is that the test is picking up lots of other things besides HIV.
Yeah, and otherwise you would have to say that this so-called retrovirus is racist because it knows what the color of your skin, your ancestry, etc., what continent you come from, what your sexual habits are or preferences. I mean, there's so many bizarre things that we've covered over the years here on the Robert Scott Bell Show. Liam has written about it. David, you've seen it from the legal realm. The precedent being set, if we could call it a precedent, I don't know in the proper legal sense or term of the word used, but certainly to have something like this overturned has to have not only, let's say, those prosecutors in the military shaking their heads or maybe having heads roll over this issue, but could it be climbing higher up the ladder, up to the Faucis and the Baltimores and these people that have made their careers on a false perspective?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I don't know. AIDS is become. I mean, maybe it started out in a noble fashion that there was these sick, mostly young gay males, and there was an inquiry on what's causing the sickness and how can we help them. And then parallel to that, there's a bunch of scientists who are researching whether viruses cause cancer, and those two parallel paths intersected with AIDS. But at some point, it lost its way. It just ran off the rails, and it became just a big business. And the big business is selling fear. And if you sell fear, if you sell that you're all going to die through sex because of this new virus, people will comply with whatever you want. They'll take any drug you want. They'll do anything because of that fear. And so, one important thing that I do when I'm talking to people is kind of reduce the fear factor and just talk about it and kind of go into the history and when you focus in on the test, because these tests are the linchpin of the entire enterprise, and you see there's not much there. It really is the emperor's new clothes. I mean, an antibody test is going to tell me whether I live or die. I mean, that's craziness, and there's no way to really confirm it if there's a dispute. I mean, the one thing that's kind of stuck in my head all these years is Magic Johnson is the most famous HIV positive guy. Why can't the doctors take a liter of his blood and say, okay, we've taken his blood, here's all the HIV viruses that we found, we counted them up, here's a picture of them, this will shut everybody up. They can't do that. They can't even find HIV in AIDS patients. It's all kind of a laboratory artifact that emanated from Robert Gallo's lab. So it's really bizarre, and you really have to peel back many different layers. This courtroom was a venue where intelligent, civilized discourse on this man's life and these tests was allowed to occur. I give the military credit for that. I give the judge credit for that. He was a stickler for the rules, but he was a very fair, honorable guy, and the result was not guilty.
Well, I'm glad for him, and that's 41 cases and counting in which charges have been dropped or significantly reduced for the OMSJ. Do I have that right?
That sounds about right. I haven't been involved too much with the prior ones, but you can check the OMSJ website. I think they have a list of people they've helped out in this predicament, because to add to the stress and trauma of being told you're HIV positive is a complete interruption of your sex life, and then you might get charged with felony battery by having sex with people if you don't properly disclose your amorphous, ambiguous HIV status. So it's too much of a burden. I mean, it really needs to be pared back, and it would be nice a good thing to happen in this trial would be if the results were sent to the Army doctors and maybe the infectious disease specialists within the Army to reevaluate the use of these tests. That would be a good result, and maybe reduce the quickness to charge people with these type of crimes. That would be a good result.
I would expect that if this word gets out, and I don't know how the legal circles operate within or outside of the military, but if this were to get out to prosecutors around the country, that if you've got a case where you're trying to convict somebody based on the positive response to a so-called nonspecific cross-reactive antibody test, whether it be, name it, Western blot or whatever, you think that now that prosecutors would think twice about this. Is this how the legal profession operates? Like they're going to get word about this OMSJ organization to say, hey, if we're prosecuting an HIV case, we better be careful about this because we might not have the case we think we have.
That would be ideal, and I hope that happens. It's hard to again, HIV is odd science. There's a small cluster of very powerful scientists who kind of run the show behind the scenes. They control the funding to scientists. If you step out of line, you get defunded. And I've never met an AIDS doctor who is open-minded or sympathetic to this type of analysis. They're kind of conformists. And you have a test, you have a viral load, you have drugs. I don't need to know anything else. So if this did expand, if there's future cases where you get similar results, I mean, that would be great. I mean, it's really kind of overbearing to be criminalizing the sexual contact.
Again, 41 cases, I think 31 in which all charges are listed as having been dropped at OMSJ, which means the things don't hold up in court. But do we have time? Do we have another segment?
Yeah, we do. Let's take a break here. We're on with David Steele, attorney from San Francisco.
Let me tease it. I have a celebrity story, and I talked to a doctor, and he was the doctor for a celebrity on a TV show, and I'll tell that story.
Okay, well, stay with us. I know I'm going to be here for that, so I hope you will be too. Say thanks to our sponsors here, those who support a message of health, freedom, and liberty, the ability to question and bring up things that are unquestionable in the old media. They're all fair game here on the Robert Scott Bell Show. Back after this.
The Robert Scott Bell Show.
David Steele mentioned Magic Johnson, of course. We've talked about the weirdness of that scenario, and they can't find anything in his blood, clearly, or else they would. They'd hang it up for the world to see in banners everywhere. So, other celebrity stories. Liam, you have one related to the HIV thing, or is this just a random celebrity story from TMZ?
Isn't TMZ a notable news source these days?
They've supplanted the Inquirer as the place where we get our news.
Yeah, if news is young celebrities who don't wear underwear. But what happened, and by the way, Magic Johnson's wife is called, it's not her name, but she's called
Cookie.
Cookie. I know. I don't know where to go with this. Life is a comedy that writes itself. Magic Johnson, Cookie Johnson. She came out, and I think it was Essence Magazine a little while ago, a number of years ago now, and said, we thank God because magic is cured. Well, Clark Baker tells this story too, and this is where I heard it from him, and I looked it up. It's true. Magic Johnson then was not, he was supposed to have been cured, right? Not testing positive or reactive or something, no viral load of any kind. Suddenly he gets an offer for some $60 million, I think from Glaxo, but it's from one of the major drug, it could have been Pfizer, and now he's HIV positive and really selling the drugs again. So a number of years ago, I'm doing this research, and I get a call, and there's a celebrity, and he's on. I'm not going to. I know it's a tease. I'm not going to say his name, but it's one of the actors who was on a show called Queer as Folk, right? So that's all. It was one of those actors, and I'm not going to tell you who because it's his business. But somebody from that show who was on that show is becoming aware, and he's becoming aware that gay men essentially have been poisoned to death on AZT. About 150,000 deaths and extra deaths, in the AZT era, at least. And he says, I want you, will you talk to this doctor I know, this doctor friend of mine, because he's an AIDS doctor, and I want to hear you're a journalist, you're researching this, and I like what you're saying, but I want to hear what it sounds like. I go, all right, I'm going to tell you, though, they don't really like to talk. So I get on the phone with this AIDS doctor, and I say, all right, so you're telling me that, how do you diagnose people? And he says, well, we use this, and we use this. I say, okay, so can I read this to you? This says that there is no standard for determining the absence or presence of antibodies, so you don't really know who's HIV positive. He says, well, we do a PCR. I say, but PCR, I mean, here's Roche, and they say that this isn't a diagnostic test. It's only used to monitor the course of therapy, which doesn't make any sense to me.
Yes.
But that's what they say.
Right.
And he says, and I say, don't you think AZT, DDL, lamivudine, and nevirapine are a little strong drugs? They're black box labeled drugs, which means they kill people at normal prescribed doses. Don't you think those are a little strong to give to people who have no specific test result? And what I heard next was the guy stopped talking to me, and he started talking to the actor. I won't say the actor's name. And he says, I'll call him, God, I hope there's no act. I got to make up a name.
Call him John Carter. That movie failed.
Yes, John Carter. He says, John Carter, the movie from the future. He says, John, he says, that's not his name, but he says, I'm very concerned. I don't think you should be listening to this person. And I said, wait a second, I'm still on the line. I'm not this person. I'm right here. My name's Liam Scheff.
Yeah.
And I said, so what about the question? Don't you think the drugs are a little strong to give to people who have no specific kind of test? Click.
Oh, wow. So what happened to John Carter after that?
I don't know. I mean, he thanked me. He said that was really interesting. I think we talked one more time, and he said, I'm got to tell people about this. That was, I think what did he say? That was like really eye-opening or something. But, didn't stay in touch. I hope he's doing fine.
Wow, fascinating to say the least. But yeah, when you corner him, now that wasn't in a court of law. He could hang up on you and walk away and continue to do the same criminal things that they claim that the sergeant did, TD, in the case, is spreading not real but fantasy type retroviruses that don't cause anything. So in the case, we come back to the OMSJ case that was successfully defended, and TD was set free, thank goodness. Now we have, a precedent set, perhaps, that means that those prosecutors within the military must now have to reconsider all HIV cases. I mean, this is a huge one.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, it was a big victory, and but there's a lot of people still hurting, and that's the I don't want to spike the football, as they say. There's so many people who have been told they're HIV positive, whose lives have been wrecked and ruined, and had to be totally adjusted out of the norm, and they felt marginalized, and I'd like to just tell those people that there's some hope there. There's some light at the end of the tunnel. You don't have to feel marginalized, and it's not the drugs that are going to necessarily save your life. If the drugs are working and you're not getting big buffalo humps on the back of your neck, maybe there's some tangential, unexpected benefit clinically for some of these drugs, but be careful long term because they do wreck your liver. But more important than that, focus on the diagnosis. You may have had a false positive, and these tests that supposedly gave you this diagnosis, there's a lot of questions there. And if you dig a little bit and ask your doctor to explain how these tests work, what they mean, what the doctor knows about these tests, you might get a little benefit there. And I think that's what came out of this trial as well, that these tests have been oversold, overmarketed, and just don't do what they claim to be doing.
Well, what does it bode for the military? I mean, what do you think's happening inside of what's that TV show? JAG,
Judge Advocate General, right?
Yeah, that was I forgot about JAG, that TV show. I like that TV show. That's exactly how it was.
Really?
That's how the trial was. It was kind of in that same type of courtroom setting.
Was everybody so good looking as the people on the show?
Yeah, there was. They were fairly. You're polished. You're spit. The shoes are shine. You got short haircuts. There was a lot of female attorneys there. I mean, the prosecution had a female JAG officer. The defense had 2 female JAG officers. So yeah, I would say they were quite almost as attractive as the TV show JAG.
So what does it bode, though? I mean, what's happening inside of the military? I mean, wait a second. So they had this kid. I don't know how old is he. I assume he's in his late 20s, if that, right?
Yeah, that's probably right.
Right. So they have this young guy who had consensual sex, and they're throwing the book at him. 37 years. My God. This group, wild-eyed group comes from out of the West, OMSJ, and they nail it, right, because these tests don't work. What is the military lives by codes of very strict, tightly interpreted, credos and such. What are they going to do?
It's a good question. It's only I can only speculate. I wish I had a fly on the wall within the the military chambers. I do know and have worked with JAG officers, and so they've given me kind of a sense of what happens, and they say that there's a lot of heads rolling in the Army right now because of this case. And more than that, though, I don't want heads to roll. I really don't. I mean, the prosecution, I thought they did on stylistic grounds. I thought they were great. They were effective. They were passionate. They were arguing their case. They just didn't have the science to support their case. So I hope their heads are not rolling. What I'd like to see is doctors' heads rolling who keep using these tests in an improper manner and terrorizing these patients. I would like, and that's maybe a little hyperbole. So let me walk that back. I don't even want their heads to roll. What I want is really smart MDs and PhDs in the Army, in our armed services, who have all these HIV institutes at Walter Reed Hospital, just to read that Nature Biotechnology paper from 1993 and either refute it or accept it. And if they can refute it, I would be impressed. But if they accept it, maybe the Army will rethink the use of all these so-called HIV tests, which probably should be renamed general antibody tests.
Right.
Yes.
General non-specific antibody tests. Take them or leave them.
With questionable at best meaning.
Yeah, and they may correlate with illness too, which is that there's some utility there. I mean, they may. That's the funny thing about these general antibody tests. They may mean nothing, that you've cleared the disease, or they may mean that your body is undergoing some stressors from something that's causing you to produce these antibodies. So,
and David, it could be positive or it could be negative, because look, if you test positive for HIV because you're pregnant, that's a positive shift, stress, or change. If you test positive because you've just had a flu vaccine, that's a negative shift change because you've got an inflammatory response to toxic poisons being injected into you. So that's why I say that this really, unless you're a really school practitioner, understand positive, let's say, antibody or other responses in the body, this is looking through a, not rose-colored, but some kind of disgusting-colored glasses where everybody's going to die because they test positive for something that they haven't even defined the meaning of.
Yeah, the tests have been, oversold and overused, and it was based on fear. And that's and if you look back in history and you kind of compare, the famous comparison is Jonas Salk. Okay, this is in the 50s. I know you guys have had some critiques of the polio epidemic, and that's fine. Just accepting it for what it was for purposes of this talk, Jonas Salk came out there, and he didn't get famous coming up with a test. He got famous coming up with a vaccine. And I don't even know, no one even knows what the test is for polio or whether it's ever been used or whether it's ever developed. But the thought was we're going to go for a vaccine that's going to prevent polio. Well, the HIV vaccine is in the same place where the weapons of mass destruction are in Iraq. It's not found, it's not developed. And that was the whole end game of all this AIDS madness out of Robert Gallo's lab, to come up with a vaccine, and it never materialized. And then they went to tests because We got to find out how many people are dying from this terrible virus. And then they went to these toxic drugs that were basically recycled cancer chemotherapy, at least at the initial start. So these guys are not, these are the, the keystone cops of science in many respects. This whole field of retrovirology is suspect, and it's new. That's another thing that has to come across, is that this is new stuff. The first human retrovirus was again discovered in Robert Gallo's lab in 1980. So before 1980, any person can walk into any courtroom under oath and say, in 1979, there are no human retroviruses. And then these people just got stuck on this bad idea that viruses cause cancer, and that morphed into, well, they don't cause cancer, but they cause AIDS. Well, and we got to get a test to find it out.
David, that's why there's an RSB show, the Robert Scott Bell Show, to help people get unstuck on things that make no sense and that could kill you for making no sense as well. David Steele, I'm so appreciative that you join us again here about the trial, firsthand knowledge, your experience there, and Liam, of course, moving that discussion ever forward with his new book coming out shortly, Official Stories. So, guys, man, amazing stuff today. It's changing the face of how we look at these things and empowering people to stay well, to get well, and to not be diagnosed to death by a nonspecific multifactorial respond, react everything, so-called antibody test.
Put down the HIV test. Back away from the HIV tests. You'll be fine.
Yes. Hey, David, thanks so much for being on board.
Hey, gentlemen, I really enjoyed it. It's always it's a pleasure to speak with both of you, and I appreciate all you've done.
Absolutely. Liam, thanks to you as well, and we've got the links up for everything coming out, the book as well. Very exciting. Autism 1 coming up this week. Health Freedom Expo coming up later in June. Liam will be there as well. And, of course, back in New York City, oh my gosh, the horror. Yes, we'll be there June 29th and 30th for the Alive Foundation's upcoming event as well. So thanks for being here, and as always, the power to heal is yours.
The Robert Scott Bell Show.